Hi guys, it's Joe, and in this video I'll be showing you my top 10 EQ tips. These are just guidelines that I followed in my years as a producer. So for number 1 is to roll off a good amount of low end off of pretty much everything you're using. You'll take out more low end on some things than others, so take out quite a lot on things like piano, acoustic guitar or female vocals, whereas you wouldn't take as much out of male vocals or basses and kicks. The reason for doing this is that it's essentially wasted energy, because a lot of speakers and headphones can't even replicate these super low frequencies. And by doing so, you can gain more headroom. So I'll just show you an example on this kick, so I'll show you what it sounds like normally. It's a pretty standard sounding kick, so let's bring up our channel EQ and we'll take out some of the low end. So we'll start high up here and just kind of fade it in. Cool. So it sounds quite good like that, so we'll just compare it with this EQ turned on and off. Right, it doesn't really sound any different. So let's have a look at our headroom when the EQ is turned off. Okay, that's minus 6.2, and when we turn it on, it's minus 8.2. That's quite a big difference for pretty much losing no quality of sound. Now imagine you've done this on pretty much everything in a project that has 80 tracks. That's a lot of headroom you've just saved yourself without really having to compromise any quality. Now, similar to this, you can get rid of some of the high end on some things. Wouldn't really do it on any vocals or any cymbals or anything like that that require a lot of the high end, but you can certainly do it on basses and some kicks, but that's kind of yours to play around with. Similar in that it just frees up some headroom. Number 2 is to use more than one EQ on the same track. I tend to use one for cuts and one for boosts, especially when working with a visual EQ like this Logic EQ right here. Having them separate makes my decisions solely based on my ears and not my eyes. So if I've got just a really extreme example here, if I've got lots going on, they're all affecting how one another look. Whereas if they're all on separate ones, I don't have any of that. It might sound great, but it'll be easier when you have them on two separate ones. Which brings me into my next point of using your ears and not your eyes. It's great having the tools to be able to see where the frequencies are that you want to affect, but you can tend to rely on that a bit too much. I certainly did when I started. I got into the habit of applying EQ, looking at it and thinking, oh god, that's way too much, or it's not enough. But it might have sounded great. It doesn't matter what it looks like, it's how it sounds. So rely on your ears and not your eyes. And number 4 is use different types of EQs. The channel EQ in Logic is pretty good, it's alright, but especially with the new vintage ones they introduced in the 10.4 update, some of these ones are great, and this is really nice for adding some high ends, this tube EQ here, whereas I tend to stick to the channel EQ for taking out any low ends, but for pretty much anything else I'll use another EQ, and it just kind of makes everything sound a bit more interesting and gives it its own flavour, because each EQ has subtle differences to it and each will sound different. So use a bit of variety in your EQs and use a few different plugins opposed to the same one on every single track. Number 5 is to train your ears. Knowing what you need to do before you even do it is a great skill to be able to do, as it's so time saving. This can come about by simply practicing and using a lot of EQ, or by going into some of your channels and just kind of isolating some parts. So just on this kick, for example, we'll isolate the mids and just see what they sound like. And then isolate the highs, the trebles, and the lows. And if you do that on quite a range of different sounds, then you have a better idea of what's going on where. So you can take a listen to something and instantly think, oh, this needs some bass increase, or the mids are too loud, or the treble's too much. You kind of know what to do straight away. You won't know the exact frequency in hertz, but it will give you a good idea of the area in which you'll need to work with him. As I said, it's something that comes with practice, but the more you do it, the quicker you'll pick it up. Number 6 is use a low shelf to increase the kick after you've cut some of the low end out. I do this because it adds just that little extra push and power to the low end. Pretty much anywhere up to say 110 Hz sounds great. Anywhere between 3 and 5 dB is good, but obviously just play around with what you want it to sound like. So it just gives it a bit more power. Number 7, for two similar parts that you want each to stand out individually, such as a rhythm guitar and a lead guitar, apply a slightly different EQ on them so they're more distinguishable. So I've just got these two guitars here, both just sampled from Logic. And to make each more distinguishable, I'll apply a slightly different EQ to each one, almost opposite. So as I was saying before, we'll just take out some of the low end on this. Yeah, it's quite good. It's quite a lot as well. As I was saying, take out quite a lot on acoustic guitars. And we'll say this is our lead sound. So lead tends to be higher frequency, especially for things that may be doing a solo. So we'll just boost some of the high ends, see how that sounds. And we want to take out some of the lower and some of the mids as well, because we don't really need too much of the bass in this. Cool, so it sounds a little bit tidier. And then as I was saying, we kind of want to do the opposite for its counterpart. So we'll open up the EQ on this one, and we'll do the same thing. We'll take out some low end, just make it the same, just for making it a little bit easier. And so we've taken out some of the low end here, but we don't necessarily want to boost the low end of a guitar like this, so we can just leave it neutral. So this one's low end cut through a little bit more than our lead, whereas obviously our lead has a high boost, so we cut out some of the high end a little bit. So it's 3200. So around that kind of area, we'll want to cut out some of our frequencies. So around there. And then maybe want to boost our mids just a little bit to make these parts stand out some more. So maybe in this area here, so around 750, we'll play around that area and see how that sounds. Cool, so now they should sound a bit more distinguishable from one another. Cool, and just as a side note, for guitars, hard pan left, hard pan right makes the world of difference. Just something that if you're not doing already, you should definitely start. Number 8 is to use a high shelf on cymbals. I like to put a slight increase on the high ends of hi-hats, rides and crashes, just to bring out some of the crispness and make it sound really bright. So I've just got some cymbals here that sound like this normally. And we want to apply quite a decent high-end boost on these, so we'll just play around with it. Anywhere from pretty much 5k up is a good area to work within. And I tend to not really go any higher than 4.5 dB, just because they start to sound a bit brittle after that, and I just want to bring out the brightness of it opposed to, well, this. Sounds much nicer when the EQ is a bit more tame. So coming through a lot more there. Number 9 is knowing that everything sounds different. It's not generally a good idea to use the exact same EQ from one kick onto another, because they're going to be different. If you're using two different samples, the EQ on the first one might sound great, but if you apply it to the second sample, it could sound awful. And with that, I'm also saying to not follow templates exactly, because everything is different. It's very rare that, when you're watching a tutorial online or reading a journal, that you're going to be using the exact same sample as them. Apart from myself, where I'm obviously just using Logic samples from this, but that doesn't matter. Those things are there to be a guideline, not a template. It's great to follow all these instructions and get a good idea of what they're talking about, but you should use it subjectively to what you're using, because what you're using will be slightly different. And by all means, have a frequency chart printed out and keep it by your workspace and refer to it for pulling out certain frequencies of what you're using. Great, but don't follow it exactly, because each sample and sound will be different. Change the EQ for what you're using, not what everyone else is using. And lastly, number 10, if to use EQ on something solo, then adjust it in the mix. Just because something sounds great isolated doesn't mean it will sound great in the mix. If you have 3 basses going on at once and you get them to all sound amazing on their own, there's a good chance that when they're played together they'll sound muddy. So apply your initial EQ to the solo channel, get it sounding great, and then adjust the EQ on the same channel whilst everything else is playing. By doing this, you'll be able to hear what needs to come through, what needs to be ducked out a little bit, just in conjunction with everything else. So those are my top 10 tips on EQ. If you have any others, please write a comment underneath, see if anyone agrees with you, see if anyone disagrees with you. And I hope you found this video useful. If you have any questions, please leave a comment or contact me via my website. Thanks a lot for watching. Cheers.